My sister sued me over our father's will, vandalized my house when she lost, broke in when I was away, and then told our whole family I'd assaulted her. This is how it actually ended. My father left me the house and most of his savings. My sister got a smaller amount of cash and his old watch collection, and I understood exactly why the day the will was read, because I was the one who'd spent 2 years driving him to chemo appointments while she didn't answer his calls. I thought the hardest part was over once the funeral ended. I had no idea it was about to get so much worse that I'd end up giving a statement to a detective about a break-in at my own house, and denying in writing to my own extended family something I never did. I need to back up because none of this makes sense without the 20 years before it. My name's Colin. I'm 29 now, 28 when most of this started. My sister Brianna is 26. Our parents split up when I was 12 and she was 9, and the split wasn't quiet. My dad had an affair, my mom found out, and the whole thing detonated our family in the kind of slow motion way that takes years to actually finish falling apart. I stayed with my dad after the divorce, mostly because our school district would have been a whole ordeal to change, and partly, if I'm honest, because I wasn't as angry at him as Brianna was. She went with my mom, and she never really came back from how betrayed she felt. I'm not going to pretend my dad was a perfect person. He cheated on my mom. That's true, and it hurt a lot of people, and Brianna had every right to be furious about it. But somewhere in the years after the divorce, being angry at him stopped being a reaction to something he'd done and became just a fixed part of who she was, a load-bearing wall in her identity that she built everything else around. He tried for years to reach her. Birthday cards that went unacknowledged. An invitation to my high school graduation that she didn't attend, even though it was my day, not really about him at all. A version of Christmas he tried to put together the year I turned 20 that she skipped without explanation. I watched him get smaller every year a little bit, in that specific way people get smaller when they've stopped expecting good news. When he got sick, pancreatic, caught late, the kind of diagnosis where the doctors use words like management instead of cure, I was the one who showed up. I don't say that to make myself sound like a hero. I say it because it's just what happened. I moved my work schedule around to drive him to appointments. I sat with him during infusions that ran 4 hours some days. I learned more about anti-nausea medication than I ever wanted to know. I called Brianna more times than I can count over those 2 years, told her exactly how serious it was, told her the timeline the doctors were giving us, told her I thought she should come see him while she still could. She always had a reason. She wasn't ready. She needed time. She didn't think she could sit in a room with him without it turning into something ugly, and maybe that was even true, I don't know. What I do know is that she never came. Not once in 2 years, not even at the very end when the hospice nurse told us it was a matter of days, not hours yet, but days. I called her from the hospice hallway with tears actually running down my face and asked her to please just come say goodbye, and she told me she couldn't and hung up. My dad died on a Tuesday morning in October. I was the only one of his kids in the room. The will reading happened about 3 weeks later, in a small conference room with a lawyer named Feldman who'd handled my dad's estate planning for years. I already knew roughly what was in it, because my dad had talked me through his decisions about a year earlier, sitting on his back porch with a blanket over his legs because the chemo had wrecked his ability to regulate his own body temperature. I know how this is going to look, he'd told me that day. I know Brianna's going to think it's not fair, but fair isn't the same as equal, and I've had 2 years to think about who actually showed up for me, and I'm not going to pretend I don't know the answer. The will gave me the house, a modest 3-bedroom in the same neighborhood I'd grown up in, worth maybe $310,000 on paper, along with the bulk of his savings, somewhere around $200,000 after the funeral costs were handled. Brianna received $20,000 and his watch collection, a set of about a dozen pieces he'd built up over decades, some of them genuinely valuable, most of them sentimental more than financial. Brianna didn't cry in that conference room. She went white, then red, and said loud enough that Feldman visibly flinched, "This is insane. We're his kids, both of us. This should be split 50-50. Brianna, I know this is hard to hear, I said, but Dad made this decision. This is what he wanted. He wasn't in his right mind, Colin. He was sick for years. Sick people don't make good decisions. He made this decision a year ago, on his back porch, completely lucid." She didn't have a response to that in the room, but I could see, even then, that she'd already decided on a version of events that made more sense to her than the one that had actually happened. A version where our father had been manipulated, rather than a version where he'd simply, finally, run out of patience for being chosen last. Our mom sided with her almost instantly. I want to say I was surprised by that, but I wasn't, not really. My mom's relationship with my dad had never fully healed even 15 years after the divorce, and I think some part of her saw the will as one last unfairness he'd managed to inflict on her family from beyond the grave. You need to split this with your sister, my mom told me on the phone 2 days after the reading. It's the right thing to do, Colin. Family takes care of family. Family showed up when it mattered, Mom. I did, she didn't. That's not the point. It's exactly the point. She told me I sounded just like my father when I said that, which she clearly meant as an insult and which I decided privately to take as something closer to a compliment. I posted about it online about a week after the will reading, mostly because I needed some kind of outside perspective that wasn't already emotionally tangled up in 20 years of family history. I laid out the whole situation: the divorce, the estrangement, the 2 years of caregiving, the will, my sister's reaction, and asked, honestly not sure what the answer would be, whether I was wrong. The response was about as one-sided as these things get. Almost everyone said the same version of the same thing: that inheritance isn't a participation trophy for existing in the same family. That showing up for someone while they're dying means something, that my sister didn't get to opt out of a relationship for 2 decades and then expect equal standing in its aftermath. A few people pushed back, gently, saying grief makes people do things they regret and maybe there was room for some kind of compromise. I read all of it. I didn't feel great about any of it, honestly, because even the validation didn't make the situation with my actual sister feel any less like a slow-motion car crash. About 2 weeks after that, I made a decision and told both my mother and Brianna about it directly. I wasn't rewriting my father's wishes to keep the peace. Brianna would get exactly what the will specified and nothing more. Brianna's response was to start sending me messages that got progressively less coherent and more furious. Some nights it was 3 or 4 texts in a row, calling me selfish, calling me a manipulator, at one point calling me something about being just like him that she clearly meant as the worst thing she could say about anyone. My mom kept pushing too, telling me I was tearing the family apart, telling me this was going to be the thing that defined our relationship going forward if I didn't fix it now while I still could. I stopped responding to most of it. Not out of spite, I was just exhausted, and I'd started to realize that nothing I said was going to change anyone's mind, because the fight was never really about the actual math of $20,000 versus $200,000. It was about 20 years of feeling like the family had chosen sides a long time before my father ever wrote a will. For a few months, things went quiet in the specific, tense way things go quiet before they get worse. I didn't hear much from Brianna directly. I heard through my mom occasionally that she was still processing, which I took, correctly as it turned out, to mean she hadn't actually let any of it go. About 5 months after the will was settled, I got served with a lawsuit. Brianna was suing me, through a lawyer she'd apparently found through a friend of a friend, claiming that I had manipulated our father into changing his estate plans in my favor. The filing alleged that I had isolated him during his illness, limited her access to him, and pressured him into the will's terms while he was medicated and, in her lawyer's words, cognitively compromised. I want to be honest about how surreal that felt. I had documentation, appointment logs, texts between me and my dad's oncologist's office, records from Feldman showing the will had been drafted and finalized over a year before his death, well before his condition had progressed to the point where medication would have been a serious factor. I hadn't limited her access to anything. She'd had my phone number the entire time. She'd chosen not to use it. My lawyer filed a motion to dismiss, and it worked faster than I expected. The judge dismissed the case with prejudice, meaning Brianna couldn't simply refile the same claim later once she gathered better evidence, because there wasn't better evidence to gather. There wasn't any evidence at all beyond her own certainty that something must have gone wrong for the outcome to be what it was. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. It was the beginning of the part of this story that stopped being about an inheritance at all. The harassment started within about 2 weeks of the lawsuit getting dismissed. Texts from her number, sometimes a dozen in a single evening. Calls from blocked numbers that I eventually figured out, through the pattern of timing, were also her. A fake social media account, thinly disguised, that started following people in my life, coworkers, my girlfriend at the time, an old college roommate, and sending them messages about what a horrible person I supposedly was. I saved everything. I didn't respond to most of it, on the advice of my lawyer, who told me engaging would just give her more material to escalate with. Then, on a Thursday morning, I walked out to my garage and found the word thief spray painted across the door in red paint, still slightly wet at the edges when I found it, like it had happened sometime overnight. I have security cameras on my property, nothing elaborate, just a couple of motion-activated units I'd installed a year earlier after a string of car break-ins in the neighborhood. I pulled the footage before I even called the police, some instinct telling me I already knew what I'd find. It was Brianna, clear as day at 2:40 in the morning, in a hoodie she probably thought made her unrecognizable, spray can in hand, standing in my driveway for close to 90 seconds before she finished and left. I called the police and gave them the footage. They took a report, documented the damage, and told me it would likely be treated as misdemeanor vandalism given the value of the damage unless there was a broader pattern that justified something more serious. I told them there was a pattern. I gave them the harassment records too. The break-in happened about 6 weeks after the vandalism while I was away for a long weekend with my girlfriend, visiting her family a few hours out of town. I came home Sunday night to find my back window broken in, glass on the kitchen floor, and the house in a state that made my stomach drop the second I stepped inside. Furniture had been shoved around, not stolen, just disturbed, like whoever had been inside wasn't looking for anything valuable so much as trying to leave a mark. Photographs had been taken down off the hallway wall, family photos, some of them from before the divorce, some of them of just me and my dad from the years after, and stacked in a pile on the floor, like someone had wanted to look at every single one before deciding what to do with them, which turned out to be nothing. They were just left there. In the bathroom, written across the mirror in what turned out to be my own dry erase marker from the kitchen junk drawer, was a single line: "You didn't deserve any of it." I called the police immediately. They processed the scene, and between the physical evidence, a partial fingerprint on the marker, and the pattern already established by the vandalism footage, Brianna became the primary suspect almost immediately. She was charged with breaking and entering, criminal property damage, and a harassment-related charge tied to the ongoing pattern of texts and calls. I sat in my living room that night, glass still not fully cleaned up, and felt something I hadn't expected to feel underneath the anger, just a deep, specific grief. For the sister I'd grown up with before any of this, the one who used to fall asleep in the back seat of my dad's car on long drives, the one I genuinely couldn't reconcile with the person who'd apparently stood in my kitchen writing on my mirror. I thought the break-in was the low point. I was wrong. About 3 weeks after she was charged, I started getting calls from extended family members I hadn't heard from in months: an aunt, a couple of cousins, my dad's older sister, all asking, in careful, uncomfortable tones, about what happened between me and Brianna when we were younger. It took me an embarrassingly long time to understand what they were actually asking about, because the question was so far outside anything real that my brain kept sliding past the implication instead of landing on it. When I finally understood, I felt something go cold and very still in my chest. Brianna had been telling people, extended family, mutual friends, apparently even a few of my own coworkers through her fake account, that I had sexually assaulted her when we were teenagers. I want to be as clear about this as I possibly can. It never happened. Not in any form, not in any version, not even in some distorted memory of an ordinary sibling conflict that got reframed years later. I called a lawyer that same day, a different one than the estate attorney, someone who specialized in defamation, and started documenting every version of the accusation I could find, every message, every person who mentioned hearing it. I wrote to my extended family as calmly as I could manage, and told them plainly that the accusation was false, that I understood how serious an accusation like that is and would never dismiss one lightly, but that this specific one simply was not true, and that I was prepared to address it through legal channels if it continued. I told them I loved my father, I loved the family I grew up in, and none of that changed the fact that something in Brianna had broken in a way I didn't fully understand, and that I couldn't keep absorbing the damage of it indefinitely. That was the day I stopped taking calls from my mother, too, not out of spite. I just couldn't keep having the conversation where I had to defend the basic facts of my own life to the person who was supposed to know me best. The criminal case around the break-in moved slowly, the way these things do. About 4 months after the charges were filed, Brianna's lawyer negotiated a plea agreement, probation, restitution for the property damage, and a no-contact order that legally formalized what had already become true in practice. The sexual assault allegations were never part of the criminal case. They were never substantiated by anyone, were never filed as an actual police report as far as I know, and never resulted in any charges against me because there was nothing behind them to charge. I want to be honest that the plea deal didn't feel like a victory. It felt like watching a slow, sad conclusion to something that used to be a person I loved. Almost a year after the will was first read, things finally started to go quiet, not resolved, just quiet, the way a fever finally breaks even though the illness underneath it hasn't fully gone anywhere. The strangest part of that year, in retrospect, wasn't the lawsuit or the vandalism or even the accusation, as much as it was watching extended families slowly figure out, on their own timeline, that they'd been told wildly different versions of the same set of facts. My aunt called me, almost 8 months after everything started, and told me she'd finally sat down and compared notes with two cousins who'd each heard a slightly different account from Brianna. One where I'd supposedly barred Brianna from seeing our dad in the hospital, one where I'd pressured him into the will while he was too medicated to understand what he was signing, one that included the assault accusation and one that somehow didn't. When she laid the three versions next to each other, none of them matched, and none of them matched the documented timeline either: the appointment logs, the will's actual drafting date, the dismissed lawsuit, the security footage. I believed her for a long time, my aunt told me, and I could hear that it cost her something to say it. I'm sorry, Colin, I should have asked you directly instead of just believing whatever version reached me first. A few other relatives reached out with some version of the same apology over the following months. Not everyone. Some people, I think, had already made their peace with a version of the story that was easier to live with than the actual one, and I've stopped trying to correct people who aren't asking for correction. My relationship with my mother is still complicated. We talk now carefully without it immediately turning into a fight, which is more than I could say a year ago. She's never fully apologized for siding with Brianna the way she did, and I don't think she's going to, but she's stopped asking me to fix things with my sister, which I've come to understand is close to the best version of acknowledgement I'm going to get from her. I have no relationship with Brianna. I'm not actively trying to repair one. I don't say that with satisfaction, I say it with a kind of tired, settled grief, the way you'd talk about a house that burned down a long time ago. I still think about the sister who used to fall asleep in the back seat of the car. I don't know if that person is fully gone or just buried under everything that happened after, and I've had to accept that I may never find out. If you'd asked me, the week the will was read, what the hardest part of that year was going to be, I would have guessed it was the lawsuit, or maybe the vandalism, something dramatic and identifiable. It wasn't. The hardest part was slower than that, realizing gradually that the inheritance itself hadn't destroyed anything. It had just exposed something that had already been broken for 20 years, sitting quietly underneath every holiday and every strained phone call, waiting for a big enough shock to finally bring it to the surface where everyone could see it. I don't know how to end a story like this cleanly because it didn't end cleanly. There was no single conversation where everything got resolved, no scene where my sister and I finally understood each other and hugged it out. There's just a quieter version of my life now, with fewer people in it, and a strange kind of peace that came less from winning anything and more from finally putting down something I'd been carrying since I was 12 years old. The belief that if I just handled things right, kept showing up, kept being the reasonable one, I could eventually hold my whole family together by myself. I couldn't, I'm not sure anyone could have, and somewhere in the last year I finally stopped believing it was my job to try.